Welcome, everyone. My name again is Stephanie Licata, and I am a senior learning strategist with Cloverleaf. We're going to talk about emotional intelligence and why it's so critical when it comes to being a lifelong leader. Why is it that really important thing that makes leaders effective? While the first publishing of the term EQ occurred in the late 80s by two individuals, Peter Salovey and John D. Mayer, they first coined that term emotional intelligence in a 1990 article. So EQ came onto the scene late 80s, and then Peter and John kind of wrote this article coining the term emotional intelligence in 1990. And then Dr. Daniel Goleman, who many of us know or refer to as the father of emotional intelligence, published a book in 1995. And Goleman really took the position that it was not cognitive intelligence that guaranteed business success, but it was emotional intelligence. So here, I was in my research for today's webinar. I came across an article from Dr. Goleman from just about 2 or 3 years ago. And it was so interesting. He was like sort of revisiting, where are we at with emotional intelligence right now? So according to Dr. Daniel Goleman himself, and don't Google, what is the most common misconception about emotional intelligence? Is it number one, that you're either born with EQ or not? Is it that EQ is about being nice? Is it that EQ is just about being empathetic? Or is it about emotional people have a high EQ? So what was that misconception? So it's actually the second answer, that EQ is just about being nice, right? And so that was what he actually commented on. It's not just about being nice, because you have to be able to have difficult conversations and be direct, but do that in a way that's cognizant of your own emotions, of the other person's emotions, of the situation at hand, right? Of the environment that you're having the conversation in, right? And so he was really surprised to stumble upon that it's really not about being nice, right? Or about nice versus mean, right? It's a little bit more nuanced than that. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Many of you are probably familiar with the 5 elements of emotional intelligence. We're going to do a quick overview, but we're going to do it through the lens of leadership. So I invite you to think of either yourself as a leader, as I quickly talk about these 5 elements, or consider another leader you have or have to interact with or in the past or present to evaluate at the level to which this element was present. So you can think about yourself as a leader and kind of evaluate, or you can think about a leader you've interacted with in the past or present and maybe evaluate that in your mind. So the first element of emotional intelligence, and these are in no particular order, is self-awareness, right? A self-aware leader is not only cognizant of their strengths and weaknesses, but they're able to actually own them, right? They own when they make a mistake. They're honest. They tell their team when they mess up, right? They're also humble enough to summon the strengths of their team to fill their own gaps. They kind of know what they're good at and know who they need to call on when they need support. The next aspect is self-regulation. So leaders who are able to self-regulate their emotions rarely fly off the handle. They don't attack others or exhibit extreme emotional reactions. They don't also rush into decisions, and they're able to remain in control of their emotions even during challenging times. So I'm sure all of us can think of a leader that hasn't had self-regulation as a strength, but we might have one that actually has. So again, be thinking about yourself or another leader as I'm going through these. Next is motivation. Leaders that are motivated have a high standard for the quality of their work, and they're connected to a sense of purpose, of why they're doing what they're doing. And this is infectious. It's something that they wear on their sleeve, right? They're able to anchor to this sense of purpose when needed and inspire others with that purpose as well. Now, sometimes, and this was sort of one of the other common misconceptions that I came across as I was doing my research for this webinar, is we kind of bundle it all up into empathy, but empathy is just part of it. Leaders with empathy are able to put themselves in someone else's shoes. They're really committed to developing other people. They speak out against injustice, bureaucracy. They're skilled at listening and giving critical feedback. But one thing that's super important is to point out the difference between empathy and sympathy. So according to our friend Merriam-Webster, sympathy is the feeling that you care about and are sorry about someone else's trouble, grief, or misfortune. When we sympathize, we're trying to understand from our perspective. Empathy is what is defined as the feeling that you understand and share another person's experience and emotions, right? Or the ability to do that, right? This means you actually make an intentional effort to try and understand, why does that person feel the way they do? Why did they do what they do what they did, right? It takes enormous patience and listening, and also the ability to suspend judgment, which is hard for a lot of people, right? And last is social skills. Leaders who possess social skills are great communicators. They know how to frame both positive and challenging news, and they don't avoid the challenging news, right? They're able to kind of read the room and know how to deliver it. They're able to communicate powerfully through change initiatives, and they understand that timing and socializing new ideas in groups is critical to getting buy-in or support. So what do I mean by that? When I was recently leading a global dispersed team of coaches, right? 12 coaches. And I can't just tell one coach something or three coaches something here. When I'm introducing something new, change, a big initiative, I have to do that all together, right? If you tell people in groups or in one-on-one, you start to create factions, you start to have people not understand, why are we doing this? So you really want to make sure as a leader that you're using that social skill of understanding timing when you are trying to lead change, make large announcements, so that you're not having sort of groupthink, factions forming, people making assumptions and not being able to answer their questions in a group setting. If you thought about sort of the leader, maybe it was yourself, maybe it was a leader that you were thinking about, which one of the elements of emotional intelligence was the leader you were thinking about during my little conversation about emotional intelligence? Which one of these did the leader really succeed at, right? Whether it's you or somebody else, which one was that leader that you were thinking about strongest in? And the reason why I wanted you to think of a specific leader is so that you could really experience some of the impact in your recollection of that person, right? That person clearly impacted you by exuding empathy, by leveraging their social skills, by showing that they possessed self-awareness. Well, why do leaders need this? Okay, well, we're going to go to my probably most overused quote, but it's one of my favorite quotes from Gallup. Well, it's a piece from Gallup's research, and I'm going to ask you to guess. Our friends at Gallup are great at putting out compelling narratives about the state of the global workplace. They do state of the American workplace, state of the global workplace. Regularly, they publish these reports. And in their research each year, they inform people, strategy leaders, and those that develop talent with a blueprint of what to do and what not to do. So who can fill in the blank here with a guess and the number? Managers account for what percentage of the variance in employee engagement scores? No Googling. Managers account for at least 70% of the variance in employee engagement scores. And if you drill down into this, it's the quality of the leader that matters, right? The quality of the leader that plays that role in those engagement scores. And if we look at this even more, specifically around leadership and practices and what makes great leaders, one of my favorite pieces of work is the research done by Kouzes and Posner, which this is in their 6th edition. I highly recommend it if you haven't dove into it. It's also great to read some of the updates. Kouzes and Posner, they actually studied what made leaders effective and the organizations that they served across industry, culture, and they found that there were 5 exemplary leadership practices that all of these organizations had in common, right? The leaders that were succeeding and creating, and not just succeeding, but creating engaged teams, creating teams that work together to create quality outputs, right? They had these 5 things in common. They were able to model the way to set a standard of treatment of others by how they communicate, how they approach situations, how they work towards goals. They were able to inspire a shared vision, right? To really strongly believe in what's possible for a team, and then being able to actually communicate and inspire others to get on board with that. They're also really great at challenging the process. They were not afraid of change, innovation. They don't ever say, well, that's the way we do things around here. They're open to challenging the status quo, and they'll call out the lack of fairness and efficiency. They also noticed that these leaders were able to enable others to act. They were able to empower them to actually do what they do best to get things done, right? And really creating a thriving team from a place of mutual respect. Lastly, leaders who encourage the heart, right, really created this sort of culture of recognition with their team. They would reward and recognize team members for their hard work, and they would do this in a very specific way. Now, these behaviors may at times reflect an evolved emotional intelligence, but it's not always that simple, which leads us to the question, and we're not going to answer this question. It just leads us to the question: Why is emotional intelligence so hard to measure and develop, especially when it comes to leaders? So, for example, those who have a lower EQ aren't always self-aware enough to know that they need to develop here, right? It's a blind spot for them. And a person's lack of emotional intelligence is hard to fix. So we can try a skill-based approach, and we're going to discuss some of those in just a moment. But it takes honest, intelligent effort over really long periods of time. The person has to be engaged in that effort, and the organization also has to put a construct around that effort. So it's not something that someone can take a course on and now be certified as emotionally intelligent, because it's a form of intelligence. So we're here today to consider the question, what does EQ actually look like at work when it comes to leadership, and why is it that final frontier? Why is it so important? We see the outcomes of emotionally intelligent leadership in terms of specific behaviors, but that's not always the same as actually having an elevated level of emotional intelligence. So this is a great time to bring in our expert panel to explore some more. I am super excited to welcome my panel here. So I'm going to ask you a quick question that I didn't tell you about, because I just want you to use one word. In one word, tell me why you said yes to being here today. Just one word you can use to describe of why you said yes to being here today.
People.
People. Okay, good.
Mission.
Mission. Awesome.
Challenging.
Challenging. Yeah, this is a challenging topic. Thank you for sharing that. So we're going to dive into our first question. So I'm going to start with you, Kelly. Can you give me an example of a leader who you've interacted with, led, reported to, right? It could be anybody you've interacted with. Maybe it's a leader of yours, someone you interacted with, who displayed emotional intelligence, and tell me about its impact on team productivity and morale.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. You know what? It actually was hard for me to narrow down this story that I wanted to tell you today. And actually, two really powerful leaders have come to mind. I reported direct to one. One was just someone very influential in our P&G community. The one that I reported to, I had a very personal situation where my mother was, I found out in the middle of a workday that my mother was diagnosed with cancer. And the behaviors, how this person, it helped me, how, sorry, I just got a new kitten, if anyone wants to know. How's that?
We're keeping it real. We're all people here. We're keeping it real. All good.
Like, dang it. But the behaviors, his name was Joe, actually changed the way that I lead people, that I manage people, and the work that I've done at P&G. And when you shared those five elements before, every single one of them I can play back to Joe. Right. And when I think about the outcome that he had on me, it's loyalty. He left the company. I'm still loyal to Joe, and I'm still loyal to his following. But more important, he was a role model to me, and I have become I'd like to think that I'm a role model to my organization as well. The other one was a little bit more removed, but she had the ability to rally an entire organization of HR leaders during COVID when we were not taking care of our own selves, right? But we were responsible for taking care of everybody else. Her ability to have the hard conversations, to redirect us, give us feedback as we needed. But I mean, in that case, when I looked at the outcome, our organizational culture survey scores increased, our productivity, our ideas, and frankly, we retained a big portion of our HR people during COVID. Of all things. So I guess there are two different examples, and I'll stop there. Like I said, many more. So.
Great. No, and that's so great. When someone can have a personal impact on how you lead, right, is so impactful. And then when you specifically talk about a time when morale was down, like all over the globe in every organization, right, and how a leader's, command of, some emotional intelligence really impacted that and had the opposite effect of everything everybody else was experiencing, right? Everybody else was experiencing people leaving and all that kind of stuff, right? So it's really a powerful testimony. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Kelly, for sharing that. Brent, how about you?
Yeah, I'd
Give me-
be happy to share. Thank you for
Oh,
having me today. Behind me is the flag of Ukraine. It's there for multiple reasons, but one of the best leaders I've ever had in my life was when I lived in Ukraine, and her name was Anya. Anya is a Ukrainian national who had lived internationally and was a leader in the company and the organization that I worked with for 4 years in Ukraine. She came to the top of my mind when you asked this question to us a few days ago. I have, I wish I had a whole lot more positive examples. I have some negative examples too that are not part of this answer, but can sure be part of the discussion here later. Anya was great at connecting with, empathizing, understanding people, but could still challenge them. I was friends with Anya on some trips to Ukraine. I met her through a circle of friends and became friends with Anya before she became my supervisor. She was able to, as she became my supervisor, a key leader in my life, she was able to navigate what can be a slippery slope of friendship and reporting to
mhm.
the same person. And I think she was able to challenge me. She exudes empathy and love and care for people, but yet there was a side of her that could still challenge me to bring out my best, push back on me at times when I needed to take more initiative with the younger leaders that in the group that I was working with. So I think just the long-term impact on me from that relationship and with Anya, I can be kind, I can be engaging, I can be empathetic, I can be a genuinely warm and kind person, but yet still push and challenge people in a way that they can receive it. So I think she's a great model of that, and I still want to grow in those
Right.
things. Those 5 points, there's
Mhm.
one or two that I'm like, oh, I want to be better at that, and I think I can be over time. But Anya, great Ukrainian lady,
That's great.
married a great friend of mine, great example of an emotionally intelligent leader.
And what you just described is actually the balance that Daniel Goleman was sharing in that article where I got that quote from. He was showing what it's not about just being nice, it's about being able to balance the kindness with the tough moments, right? And being able to do both of those well, right? So thank you so much for sharing that, Brent. Brad.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting subject. And the reason I said challenging as my one word for being here is because I think emotional intelligence, like strategy, like culture, like innovation, suffers from semantics. I mean, there's so many different ways we can interpret the term. You listed the five elements, but if you dig deeper into Goleman, there's actually 25 separate skills that
Yeah.
fit under those five elements. And so to say, give me an example of somebody who displayed emotional intelligence, well, that is a very wide range of behaviors and actions. But there is one person who I always use over and over again when people ask for an example of somebody who exhibited a high level of EQ. And his name was Doug Block. I started my career in nuclear engineering in the US Navy. And Doug was my department head on my first deployment to the Persian Gulf. And the reason I think he's a good example is there are many different reasons, but I think someone's true EQ, almost like their true character, really shows itself in challenging situations. It's the comment about the ship captain who can, it's easy to steer a ship in calm waters, but how do you do when the waters are more challenging? And in deployment, it's a challenging environment. It is extremely stressful. It's very fast paced. I saw that my colleague and our chief learning officer, Kristen Carter, is in the participant room, and I was on the Eisenhower, and Kristen was on the Enterprise, and the Enterprise was supposed to relieve us after a 6-month deployment, and it couldn't get out of port on time, so they were actually 3 months late, and so a 6-month deployment became a 9-month deployment. So all of those things combined create a really difficult environment. And And Doug was just amazing in that his ability to, I think, do three things really well. One is that he made everybody he interacted with feel valued. So he had that personality where when you were interacting with him, he was focused on you. He wasn't focused on other things. He wasn't looking at clocks. He wasn't checking his watch. He was focused on the conversation. So you felt valued. You felt like he was listening to you. He empowered you. He would, kind of to the point that Brent was making, he didn't compromise his standards in exhibiting his EQ. He set very high standards, but then he would walk with you every step of the way to make sure you had what you need to meet the standard. And then the last one was, he made you feel really capable. So things that you maybe thought you couldn't do, through his tutelage and through his support, you felt like I can do more than I ever would have thought imaginable. And I think a lot of that connects also to the fact that he set such high standards, things that maybe seemed unattainable. And I think the last thing I'll say about Doug is, and I thought about this with other people who I've encountered who I think have really high EQ rather. And I think they all had something in common that didn't strike me until I was going through the questions that you sent to us a couple of days ago. And it was that they all had extraordinarily strong personal ethos. Like they all had a really strong sense of their values. They had a strong sense of their ethics. They had a strong sense of where they fit in the world, what their purpose is. All of the people I can think of as by example were, I would consider faith-based leaders, but in thinking about it a little more and kind of stretching that a bit, I don't think faith in the religious sense is a requirement to have high EQ, but I do think having high EQ does require a strong sense of self and a strong personal ethos. And Doug exhibited all of that. So really great guy. Went on to do extraordinary things. I'm sure he's doing extraordinary things right now, although he's retired. So he might be doing extraordinary things on a golf course right now, but.
And, thank you so much for sharing that, Brad. It's very, very powerful testimony to the impact. So if you think about all the examples that we just shared, the impact of possessing emotional intelligence does not leave the person, right? And it's the same when we have a leader that doesn't possess emotional intelligence, that doesn't leave the person either. People remember being on the other end of that type of leadership that emotional intelligence wasn't the lens through which it was being offered, right? So that's the level at which we have to impact people as leaders ourselves, and the level at which we have to influence other people that are leaders in organizations to lead from this place. Now, I'm going to go back to you, Kelly, and really just from your perspective, what is the connection between emotionally intelligent leaders and any one of these categories: engagement, retention, or job satisfaction? You can speak to anyone that you feel really calls to you. But what's the connection between emotionally intelligent leaders and engagement, retention, or job satisfaction?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this, and I've seen several pieces of data. Okay, I have seen data that connects emotional intelligence to our IQ, if you will, and it's the EQ that sets the C-level officers apart from others. I think more like reality though is that emotionally intelligent leaders set a positive work culture. When there's a positive work culture, efficiency, productivity, innovation, ideas, risk taking, and ultimately, I think. At least at P&G, we firmly believe that there's this very strong connection between emotionally intelligent leaders and the psychological safety of an organization. And we see that over and over. But it's what people are doing in the organization that has the emotionally intelligent leader. So
great. Thank you for sharing that. And it's all cascades from there, right?
It all comes down from the leader. Absolutely.
Brent, how about you? Where do you see that connection between the emotionally intelligent leader and engagement, retention, or job satisfaction? You can talk about any one of those things or all together too.
I think of a customer that I work with. His name is Michael. The AG in my company name actually means agriculture, and I work with a lot of ag companies. this is a man who's continued his company's legacy. He's the current CEO and manager of the company, and his grandfather, who's 93, is still involved with it and started it in the it was in the early 50s, I think. There was a little bit of a gap between how this CEO was perceived by his team members and especially new team members. So he started a program where he would bring people in, do some new hire training. His mom cooked some of the best food you can imagine and started having people in on a regular basis. So when those trainings were occurring and they were getting FaceTime with him, I think the employees, the staff team, recognized a warmth, a connection, and an emotionally intelligent man that they didn't get much of a chance to interact with. So once he has begun, he's still working on this, but he puts himself in front of employees and engages with people more than like doing all the tasks. He's wired to do the tasks. That's how his grandpa built the business. That's the way his dad continued it. But they were really having trouble retaining employees. So over the last 2 years, they put that program together. He's put himself in a position where people can engage with the emotionally intelligent person that he is, but that people didn't recognize. And we did one more new hire training for them, and they're so well staffed now. The retention is really high. There's only one final person in the new hire training after we were doing like groups of 12 initially. So it's really helped on the retention of employees and keeping them longer term.
So just that visibility made such a difference, right? It was just that connection, those sort of separate moments that really created that connection.
That's correct. And he didn't put himself out there enough in the past, but he is now. So the emotional intelligence was there. He was just too busy doing other things to engage with his team well.
Right. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Brad, how about you? Where's that connection between emotionally intelligent leaders and engagement, retention, or job satisfaction?
Yeah, I think I'll have to go back to something I said at the start, which is that the subject is so big, that the topic, the terminology is really too big to make any kind of causal link, I think, to the three. So I would tend to want to look at it by separating into its 5 elements. And I think, as an example, if you look at the motivation element, you would say, well, a leader who's high in the motivation element and all the various traits that make that up would tend to drive higher levels of engagement, because you are setting a high standard and you're bringing people along and you're helping them accomplish their goals and building levels of self-efficacy. So I think leaders high in motivation would be good at driving engagement, whereas you might say leaders who exhibit a high level of empathy or social skills or situational skills, those leaders would be good at driving high levels of retention across the organization, because if you exhibit a high level of empathy, I feel like you understand me. I feel like you're making the effort to see the world from my perspective, and I'm more likely to be loyal and want to stay. So, I think there's a really interesting study that was done by Jerry Matthews, who was out of the University of Cincinnati. He's now at the University of Central Florida. But he was looking at, it was a co-authored paper with two other authors from around the globe. And it was titled The 7 Myths of Emotional Intelligence. And one of the things that they were looking at were the studies that make such claims as, for example, leaders with high emotional intelligence have more levels of success in organizations than leaders with high IQ. And the point that they were making was that there's really no empirical data to support that. There's not enough rigorous study to support that a lot of that is anecdotal, because emotional intelligence suffers from a lack of clear definition and a construct about what we mean. So I think if you look at it through the lens of the 5 pillars and you say, give me an example of a leader who had high motivation or high self-awareness or high self-regulation, I think you have a better likelihood of making that causal link
Right.
that everybody's always looking for. I mean, there are people who spend their entire lives studying the relationship between empathy and workplace satisfaction, for example, build a whole body of work on that. So yeah, I think that's how I'd answer it. I'd prefer to want to break it into some smaller pieces and then look at how that impacts success.
No, and I definitely appreciate that perspective because I think, it's, in a perfect world, like, right, everybody has these abilities, and these are the people that are promoted that have these strengths in these 5 areas, right? But we know that's not the case. So I'm going to kind of blend the last 2 questions to be our last question to reflect on. And so we want to get practical, right? Because like Brad said, this is a little bit hard to define in terms of creating that connection of what the causal connection, right? What best practices, Kelly, and you can even share ones that you use, what best practices or initiatives can people or talent strategy leaders employ to help develop emotional intelligence within their leaders? And what are some future trends do you see that are sort of bringing this to the forefront? So what best practices or initiatives can people or talent strategy leaders employ to help develop emotional intelligence within their leaders? And what are some trends that you're seeing, in the forefront?
Yeah, this was probably my favorite question to really reflect on. Because I think it is so actionable. So at least in my company, we do hire for emotional intelligence, or at least the elements of emotional intelligence, among many other skills. And we do believe that it can be broken down into that concrete set of skills that can then be developed. So as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm over talent development, and we develop we offer training opportunities for emotional intelligence at multiple levels of the organization. So we hit it very general with our individual contributors, very specifically with our people managers, and very purposefully at our top down, our what I would consider our enterprise leaders. So I do believe that the elements of it can be trained. But if you were kind of going to take like a practical, tactical approach to this, I was kind of thinking about this, and I actually have a sticky note over here where you break down the elements of emotional intelligence. I am the first to admit that I have my opportunity area, if you will, is self-regulation, probably just like everybody else is on on this call. And so I had to kind of proactively think through my strategies. What are my strategies? My strategies are to breathe. Maybe I have the luxury of counting to 10. Hopefully I even have the luxury of sleeping on an answer. Sometimes if I'm still stewing over something, I will sit down and create an emotions versus reason list to make sure I'm making a data-based decision. So find your opportunity area and break it down, if you will. And I think the last thing I would say is probably become a student of the topic and hold yourself accountable to role model to the organization. Read everything you can get your hands on. Just earlier today, I kind of turned around, and while I don't have Goldman's work, I promise you I have it at my office. I do have Bradbury's work. I have the Harvard top 10 articles back here on my desk. So get your hands on whatever you can, and then hold yourself accountable to behaving this way in your organization. My team and I laugh. They have created an equity for me, and this equity is compassionately direct. And as we were talking at the beginning of it, I said, wow, that's kind of, I need to be direct. I need to be able to tell what's going on, give the tough feedback, but I can do that in a very compassionate and growth mindset way. So those would be my my strategies on how we can employ. Now, what am I seeing? I imagine we're only going to see the importance of emotional intelligence increase in the organization. I think people are finally beginning to truly understand what it means and the impact that it can have on an organization. So I don't have great answers there, but just what I'm seeing in-house is a more concerted effort on the topic, and was thrilled to hear the Cloverleaf team was discussing this. So thank you for having me, though, by the way.
Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing that. I love that. That's so practical and just from an individual level. So it's great. All right, Brent, how about you? What best practices or initiatives can people or talent strategy leaders employ to help develop emotional intelligence? And what are some trends that you're seeing?
So I may sound like an advertisement for Cloverleaf here, because Cloverleaf is a tool that we use often and regularly with a lot of different companies that we work with. And that company that I was visiting yesterday, we do that. So it really hits on that self-awareness piece, with there's so many different assessments in there that give you multiple angles on a person, not just one. So that really helps with the self-awareness piece, the empathy piece, as well as people recognize how they are perceived by others. That can really help them develop the empathy piece. So it sounds like a commercial. Nobody's paying me to say this, but I really like Cloverleaf as the tool to help with those things. I also take it a lot of those assessments in Cloverleaf I was certified on before I discovered Cloverleaf, and there's some extra ones in there that I wasn't certified on. There's a 360 part that really helps with this. So whether it's formal or not, knowing how you're perceived by others, your team, your reports, that is such a key thing that I try to work with regularly on my customers, to help them tune in to how they're perceived. That's part of, the self-awareness is part of it, but how you're perceived by others is a key thing. And that can lead to a lot of more healthy working through conflict, and it can lead to more regulated may not be the right word, more appropriate expression of emotion. If somebody's frustrated, when some of these companies that I've worked with, there's very good communication, and sometimes there's somebody from 2 generations before that started it. Their way of dealing with conflict is yelling and cussing at the current person and walking away, and it's never talked about again. So I think I like, Cloverleaf. I'm not saying it's a perfect tool. It's a great tool, and it helps us on several pieces: the self-awareness, the empathy, controlling your own emotions, those type of things.
Thank you for sharing that. And what any future trends you're seeing just about how you expect emotional intelligence to impact leadership in the future?
I think with the generation that's here, I just worked with a group of interns for a faith-based organization, and what they're expecting versus what my age of people and the director of that organization are expecting, there's still some gap. There. So trying to become more emotionally aware and in tune with that generation, I think, is key. So bridging the gap between age groups, I think, is a key thing. Not just say, oh, those new people don't know how to work. We've got to connect with them and relate to them, and try to engage with them in a way that they could receive it. So it's kind of taking these concepts a bit deeper across the generational gap.
That's a great point. I've been working with a number of teams who are struggling with that and how to do that, and say, tell me how to talk to this generation, right? So we first have to understand a little bit about ourselves too, right? Before we do that. So thank you for sharing that. Brad, what about you? What best practices or initiatives can people or talent strategy leaders employ to help develop emotional intelligence within their leaders, and any future trends you're seeing?
Yeah, I think there are 3. I think one is very tactical, and I think it cuts across all 5 elements, and that's the ability to be good at active listening. I think that's, whether you're talking about self-awareness or self-regulation, or how to motivate others, or empathy, or situational awareness, your ability to be able to actively listen, which is much different than just hearing what someone is saying. I think is a very tactical skill. You can learn, you can practice the elements of active listening. So I would say that's one. I would say the other two are strategic in nature, or more strategic in nature. And one is helping leaders build reflective practices. So giving them the time and the space to reflect on events and reflect on behaviors and reflect on the impact that they're having on those around them and their interactions. And I think whether that reflection is individual or whether that reflection is collective, doesn't really matter. So I can be doing it with a group of managers and we can be debriefing an event that happened and kind of figure out where things went right or wrong, or it could just be, me all by myself, just really reflecting on the day and how I impacted others. And then the last one, which I think is also strategic in nature, and I alluded to this earlier when I was talking about Doug Block, is helping our leaders develop and uncover their personal ethos. I got a call coming in from California if anyone wants to talk to them. So I think helping leaders uncover their personal ethos, and by that I mean their sense of character, their values, their moral beliefs, their guiding principles. Because without that strong sense of self, the other elements of emotional intelligence aren't possible. Nothing is possible without a high degree of self-awareness. You certainly can't self-regulate if you're not self-aware. You can't motivate if you're not self-aware. You can't practice empathy if you're not self-aware. So it all goes back to having that strong sense of self. And then I think in terms of the trends, I think the world right now craves authenticity. I mean, things feel so fake. Social media, I think, has us in a world where what you see is not what people are actually experiencing. So again, to tie that last strategy together to the future trend, I think those leaders who have a high sense of self, a high sense of values, a high sense of moral purpose, will be really successful moving forward, because I think the world craves that right now. It doesn't want your fake self. It wants to see, it wants to interact with the real person. And so I think that's going to be a skill that's going to be in high demand as things get more complex.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Brad. I really appreciate it. We have and I appreciate the distinction around, the strategy and also just the best practice of active listening. We actually have a question that came in for you, Kelly. What are some ways you practice being compassionately direct with your team? I'm still struggling with the balance of being either too direct or too compassionate. Suggestions for learning how to better balance that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. I was in the thinking about how I could respond to Sarah in the call. So I am a big proponent of normalizing feedback. And when I say that, it means I ask for it, I receive it, I internalize it, I make it cool to give feedback up, down, left, right, however we need to be able to give feedback. You have to have trust and, if you will, to steal from Franklin Covey, have an emotional bank account with your team. And when it's time to have the tough conversation, to give some harsher feedback, don't be afraid to do it, but do it in a way, that maybe pairs it with coaching, that shows a growth mindset, shows your belief in them. And I love what Brad just said about authenticity. If we are not authentic in the in the office, our team, they know that. I think authenticity is such a key here. I have a lot of ideas and probably could do an hour long.
Because our next webinar will be how to be compassionately direct with Kelly. I just want to thank Kelly, Brent, and Brad. Thank you so much for not only being trusted and treasured customers of Cloverleaf, but also people that really are committed to the same thing that I am, right? To just creating workplaces where great people want to be and stay, and to creating those environments where we engage people authentically and help people grow. I want to also thank you for all the things you're doing that nobody sees that makes such a difference. We often don't get thanked for those things that we do naturally. So I want to thank you, and I want you to really understand the impact that it has on people, because you shared the impact that it had on you. Thank you so much for the work that you do. Any parting words of inspiration from our panel before we leave? Any parting words of inspiration? your favorite quote, your own sort of motto, anything you want to share.
All right, I'll go first. So I'm saying things now to stall as my brain is turning. I liked your authenticity quote. So I've had more, I think if we're not authentic, we can't really do business well, or we can't connect with people. So if we're not authentic and we're faking emotional intelligence, people will see through it. So I'm stealing yours, Brad. Be authentic.
I think I'm gonna make a plug actually for a book called Lead Yourself First, which I actually posted on LinkedIn about a month ago. There's a really excellent book about the importance of solitude, which I referenced earlier, and reflective practice, and that leaders don't do enough of it because we're so busy going from one thing to the next. So Mike Irwin, Lead Yourself First would be my parting wisdom to the group.
Awesome. Excellent. We love a good book recommendation. And Kelly, lastly.
I would say two things: become a student to be able to become the teacher, and then role model, role model, role model, role model. And if I didn't mention it, role model.